Hello, y'all. I'm here with my husband, John.
Local idiot.
We're gonna talk about Andrew Jackson and the age of Jackson. Can you scoot it? Oh, let's get closer together. Okay, there we go. So, obviously, Andrew Jackson is an important figure for American history, American politics, but specifically in our area of Tennessee. Our college is named Volunteer State after the Tennessee Volunteers that fought with Jackson during the War of 1812. So Jackson is kind of a very important figure. And a lot of people think he was great, and a lot of people think he was awful.
Yeah, I was going to say polarizing.
Yeah, polarizing, exactly. So when he became, when he was running for president, he was a really different kind of guy. Like, he was the first president that didn't have like an education. He didn't come from a wealthy family. Yeah. He was the first president to come from the West, which was Tennessee at the time. All of the other presidents before him, he was the 8th president. All 7 presidents before him. The 8th.
Thought it was the
7th? Okay. Now I'm questioning myself. Okay, but I should know that.
That's what Wikipedia
Okay. All the other presidents before him came from either Virginia or Massachusetts. And all of them had been wealthy and well educated. He comes along and he made a name for himself as an Indian fighter in the War of 1812, and as sort of this real tough guy that doesn't put up with anybody's crap. When he was running for president in 1824 against John Quincy Adams, his supporters came up with the slogan, "Adams can write, but Jackson can fight." Like, what does that tell you? That's what they were advertising. And these were his supporters. They were basically saying, like, our guy's tough. Like, he's killed all these Indians. Like, and, you know, Adams's people were like, well, our guy can speak 7 languages. And he went to these fancy universities, and he was Secretary of State, all this stuff. And Jackson's people were like, well, we don't care. Like, our guy, you know, he's tough.
Sounds all too
It's some of it sounds familiar. Yes. So Jackson won the election in 1828, and he was this whole new kind of president. And that's why people say, like, this was the age of Jackson, or they'll say Jacksonian democracy, because he changed our political system. I'm just going to say this out in the open. I am not a big fan of Andrew Jackson, but as there were some important changes he made in our political system that are worth considering. So one thing that people always attribute to Andrew Jackson incorrectly is universal white male suffrage. So they'll say, oh, in the age of Jackson, all white men could vote. And they'll say that Jackson did that. And no, Jackson did not do that. Jackson was the result of that. Before the 1820s, only wealthy property-owning white men could vote, except for in Pennsylvania. Any white man in Pennsylvania could vote. But otherwise, you had to own property, which means that you weren't poor. That started to change in the late 1820s because of the market revolution. We talked about the market revolution, but that was where a lot more people were beginning to work for other people, like work in factories and industry and business, and not necessarily just as a farmer. So a lot of people were getting rich and they didn't own land. Maybe they lived in cities. And so all of a sudden, like, this law that says you have to own property to vote was a bit outdated, because there were some wealthy people who didn't own property and they made their money in banking or something. So this is what led to universal white male suffrage. It wasn't Jackson. However, Jackson probably wouldn't have been elected if it weren't for universal white male suffrage. What do you think? If only wealthy
black people couldn't vote?
Well, no, I'm talking about universal white male suffrage. Like, that happened, making it to where every white man could vote. Without that, Jackson probably wouldn't have been elected, because the wealthy people did not support him. And so now all of a sudden you have all these people who aren't necessarily wealthy. Any white man could vote. And so they're going to vote for someone like Jackson. So rather than
people person.
Yeah, exactly. He's, claimed to be for the people. So it's not that he created universal white male suffrage. It's that he was a result of it. He claimed to be for like democracy for everyday people, but a lot of that depended on taking rights away from others. So he did a lot to sort of expand opportunities for white men. And you didn't have to be rich. So a lot of white men who weren't rich thought that, this is great. There's more opportunities for me. But those opportunities didn't extend to other people, especially Native Americans and African Americans. Yes.
Okay, was he in the military before he was in the office?
Yes, he was a general. Yeah.
Okay, what made him be a general? Did he work his way up, or was he just that like white privilege type shit?
Well, I mean, it was most of the military was white, so yeah. So he was a good general. I mean, he was a good fighter. I don't think that as much as I don't think that you can sort of take that away from him. He was a good military man. So he earned this reputation. He helped the United States acquire Florida. He helped win the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans. So he kind of was a celebrity for really helping to win the War of 1812. Yeah. So he did a lot to sort of expand the idea, the democratic culture. It seems to many people that things weren't as elitist anymore. There was someone in the White House who was not an elitist, and a lot of his supporters were not wealthy. So it kind of leveled the playing field as far as wealth among white men. Other groups did not feel that same sort of opportunity expanding during the age of Jackson. What is the one thing that Jackson is most known for, in your opinion?
Hermitage.
The Hermitage. Okay, maybe around here.
Or statues in Richmond. God, I don't know.
Trail of Tears?
Oh, well, yeah. Okay, now you're throwing that out. Yeah.
Okay, so
driving the
we need to talk
natives out.
We need to talk about the Trail of Tears. Okay, so when Congress, the reason this got brought up during Jackson's administration was because there was a lot of really good land in Georgia. It was good for growing cotton, for one. So there had been people in Georgia for a long time who wanted to move the Native Americans out, particularly the Cherokees, for growing cotton. Cotton, as we talked about in this class, was becoming the dominant economic staple of the South, and it was 90% of cotton workers were slaves. So one thing about cotton is you can't continue to grow cotton in the same place over and over again. You have to keep acquiring new land. It depletes the soil. So around like in the early 1800s, a lot of people in Georgia were like, gosh, there's all these Native Americans that live on this land that's perfect for growing cotton. We need to acquire that land. So there had been a desire for it for quite some time, but it wasn't until gold was discovered there that there was a serious move to get the Native Americans off that land. So when that happened, Georgia, when gold was discovered on Native American land in Georgia, the state of Georgia tried to take that land from the Native Americans, from the Cherokees particularly. And the Cherokees took this all the way to the Supreme Court because they said Georgia as a state does not have the right to take our land. Our treaty is with the federal government, not the state of Georgia. So they went to the Supreme Court, they went above Georgia, and they said this is a federal issue, not a state issue. And they appealed to the Supreme Court as a way to keep their land. But the case was structured on this issue of who has jurisdiction in Cherokee land in Georgia. Is it the state of Georgia or is it the federal government? The Supreme Court said it is the federal government, not the state of Georgia. Like treaties with Native Americans are done with the federal government. They can extend past state lines. So the Cherokees actually won that case. The Supreme Court Justice was John Marshall. And when Andrew Jackson heard John Marshall give his opinion on this and basically said that Georgia has no jurisdiction in Cherokee land in Georgia, Andrew Jackson said, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him defend it. What do you think that means?
Fuck off.
John.
Sorry.
Okay, you didn't hear that. But basically, yeah. I mean, basically, we have a president saying, I am not going to comply with the ruling that the Supreme Court just issued. What do you think about that?
That's not cool.
Not cool. I mean, we have this checks and balances system where there's 3 branches of government, and one of them is the Supreme Court. One is the president. The Supreme Court just said, this is unconstitutional. That is the job of the Supreme Court, to say what's constitutional or not. And they said Georgia does not have the constitutional right to move the Cherokees off their land. And the president said, well, what do you want to do about it? What do you want to do about it? And so Andrew Jackson defied the order of the Supreme Court and asked Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. And Congress, it was very close, but Congress passed it. So they basically ignored the Supreme Court. That's a really bad precedent. When you have 3 branches of government that have the system in place, and one of them, and 2 of them actually just say, we're just going to ignore the Constitution. That's unconstitutional. The Constitution sets up the checks and balances. So Andrew Jackson ignored the Supreme Court. This is a failure of the American political system. This is why we have checks and balances. As I always like to remind students, not every person in America was bad. Not every person in America supported the Indian Removal Act. As a matter of fact, there were some very strong opponents of it, and they spoke out. One of them was Davy Crockett, who was an old friend of Andrew Jackson's. They had fought together for years, and they were kind of like, Tennessee buddies. And Davy Crockett said, no, this is not okay. We can't do this. Walt Whitman said this is wrong. A lot of Americans said this is wrong. This is the Cherokees' land. We have negotiated with them by treaty. We can't. So a lot of people spoke out against it, but it did no good. Congress and Andrew Jackson went ahead with it anyway. And Cherokees and 4 other tribes, the Chickasaws, Creeks, Cherokees, Chickasaws, Creeks, I'm drawing a blank, 2 other tribes were moved from their native lands, and it was Georgia, East Tennessee, West North Carolina, North Alabama. So it included like 5 states. It wasn't just Georgia. And they were moved all the way to Oklahoma in what has become known as the Trail of Tears. So for many people, this was a big problem. And this actually started the big opposition against Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson created the Democratic Party that we have today. He made parties more important, and
that we have today.
It's the same Democratic Party. Yes, he created the Democratic Party. His people, his advisors, Martin Van Buren, they started this new party. And somebody referred to Andrew Jackson as a jackass, and so that became the emblem of the Democratic Party, that rabbit. So,
it's a donkey.
Oh wait, I'm thinking of donkey. The rabbit was a part of the Democratic Party. I don't know when it got replaced by the donkey, but it was the rabbit, the jackass, for a while. So you might think that we have this climate in which states' rights and federal power are often conflicting, as we've talked about in this class. And Andrew Jackson just basically made this move for states' rights against the federal government. He supported Georgia against the federal government, even though it was unconstitutional. So you might think Andrew Jackson was a states' rights kind of guy. Well, it's not that easy. There were other issues in which he supported federal power over states' rights. And one of them had to do with a tariff, a tax that was really taxing South Carolina's cotton a lot more, like taxing them to the point where it was no longer profitable for them to grow cotton. So South Carolina was like, we don't agree with this tariff. It's too much. It benefits people in the Northeast. It benefits industry. It's hurting us as cotton growers. So
is that not industry?
It's farming. No, they just farm. Like, they're not actually selling a finished product. They're selling an agricultural product, not a finished product. So it's not industry. They would send it to the North, and the North would make clothes out of it. That was industry. So South Carolina was very much against this tariff. They called it the tariff of abomination, and they actually threatened to secede from the country if they were like, we're not going to pay this tariff. And Andrew Jackson was like, well, if you don't pay the tariff, then I'm going to use force to make you pay the tariff. So he asked Congress to pass the force bill, which authorized the president to use force against a state that is not complying with federal law.
South Carolina.
Right. That sounds fine, except for the fact that
you're attacking your own people.
And also Jackson just supported Georgia against the federal government's power. So he wasn't consistent. So he basically said to South Carolina, you do have to pay this tariff, and I will use force in order to make you pay it. So ultimately, they reached a somewhat of a compromise where the tariff was lowered. So South Carolina said they would pay the tariff, but then they nullified the force bill. They said, we still have the power to say we're not going to agree with federal law, so we'll pay your tariff, but we're going to nullify your force bill. And when you nullify something, it's the state saying we don't have to comply with that. We're nullifying that. So for many South Carolinians, if that's even a word, the tariff was an issue, but the bigger issue was that they felt like the federal government was taking on the power to end slavery. Not that Jackson wanted to do that. He owned over 100 slaves, but they felt like if the federal government is taxing cotton at such a high rate, and cotton is produced by slaves, and the state doesn't have the right to nullify that, then what are they going to do next? End slavery? So the bigger issue at hand was the issue of a state's right to nullify a federal law. Sure, the tariff was a problem, but the bigger issue was slavery, really. So if the federal government makes a law, and some people say that's unconstitutional, whose job is it to determine if it's unconstitutional or not? Is it the state's job? Is it Congress, the Supreme Court, the president?
It's hard to say these days. It's the people with guns.
No, I'm talking about the system. The Supreme Court has the role to determine what's constitutional or not the states. The states don't have that job. But South Carolina was saying, well, if we don't agree with this law, the tariff, we're going to say it's unconstitutional and we're not going to comply with it. Andrew Jackson was like, you will, because that's the way the Constitution works. So he forced them to comply with the tariff. But they were definitely getting this idea of secession on their mind. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in 1860. So Andrew Jackson had kind of he wasn't consistent when it came to states' rights versus federal power. As I mentioned, and as most people know, he owned a lot of slaves, so he was very concerned about the federal government not interfering with slavery. Not a very consistent person as far as which branch had more power. Andrew Jackson is often blamed now and at the time for causing the Panic of 1837. And it was the worst economic depression in America to date. It later was, replaced by worse depressions and the depression of the 1890s. But in 1837, it was the worst depression the country had seen. And most economists and historians blame it on the fact that Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States. He didn't agree with banks. He thought they were tools of the elite. He didn't understand how they worked, is basically what it comes down to. He didn't understand economics. And he wanted to be this sort of like man of the people, looking out for the poor people. So he convinced people that the banks were tools of the elite and that they were the ways in which rich people kept their wealth, which really isn't the bank's function at all. So he refused to sign the bank's rechartering. And as a result, the Second Bank of the United States ceased to exist, and all these state banks started opening up in different states. States were opening their own banks. What do you think happens when states open up their own banks?
They make their own rules. They
make their own currency. They make their own rules. There's no uniform currency. You can't have that. By this time, a lot of the country was industrialized. People were using money for business transactions. And all of a sudden, these states have different banks with different currency. It just created all this confusion, major economic problems. And it led—
How many currencies were there?
Every state had their own. At the time, there were, you're putting me on the spot again.
I'm sorry. You're putting me on the spot.
I'm not sure exactly how many states there were at the time. The United States did not extend too far west. So there were probably, I would say, maybe 20 states at the time. That's just a guess.
And they all had their own currency?
Yeah, there was no national bank anymore. States were creating their own banks and their own currency. It led to this massive economic confusion, which led to the Panic of 1837. So in the American History Crash Course, which I love so much, John Green says, Andrew Jackson is probably the worst person to be on American currency. Like, he's on the quarter. And like, he didn't understand currency or banks at all.
He on the 22?
Oh, yeah. Yes. He's not on the quarter. He's on the 20. Gosh,
Yeah.
I have a cold.
Jesus. Washington's on the quarter.
I know.
Come on, learn your history.
I shouldn't do this while I have a cold, but learn your history. But yeah, just had a very kind of weak understanding of economics, and this depression was really detrimental. It didn't really set in until after Jackson's presidency was over, but his policies with regards to the bank led to this depression. So he was a very polarizing, I'm glad you used that word, that's the perfect word, very polarizing president. Some people felt like he's basically a hooligan. Whenever he was running for president in 1824, his opponents, the Adams campaign, one of their campaign posters had 8 coffins on it, and it was to represent all 8 people that Jackson had killed. So that's not including
only 8.
That. Well,
come
okay,
on,
that's
man.
not including war. It's not including Native Americans or war. It's only including people that were killed outside of
like
war.
Duels,
and he killed 2 English soldiers for like insubordination. Like they weren't our enemy at the time. So yeah, but most of it was duels. So this man, his opponents were like, this guy's killed 8 people and you want him to be president?
He's brave.
So as far as his opponents go, he was seen as sort of unqualified, uneducated, unsophisticated. But his supporters, they loved that about him. They thought, here's somebody who's just like me. Here's somebody who represents people like me. We don't have someone like John Quincy Adams who's fluent in 7 languages and has all this wealth. We have someone who's just like us. So many people like that about Jackson. Jackson made the role of the president much stronger. He was the first president to really use the veto. He vetoed 9 acts of Congress. So you have these hundreds of people voting on something, Congress, and then you have one person, Andrew Jackson, vetoing it. He did that 9 times. So many historians would say, like, that's not very democratic for one person to be overriding the opinions of the whole entire Congress. So he made the office of the presidency much, much more powerful with very strong supporters and very strong opponents. He supported slavery. He made his wealth off slavery. He traded slaves for a good period of time before he became president, and that was one way that he made his wealth. So obviously not a president in favor of African-American rights at all, not even the rights to own their own body. So it's probably fairly obvious that I'm not a huge fan of Jackson, but I do have to say that he brought a different face to American politics. He did sort of represent this change from the idea that politics is only for the wealthy. He made it to where, like, unwealthy people, poor people, white men could have a voice and could have a role. And that's an important step. It's not perfect. There's still plenty.
Sounds like a slight downfall to American politics also, though.
That argument could be made, and that argument was made at the time by people like Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams, and even old John Adams was still alive, and they were saying, original John Adams, they were saying this man's unfit to be president, and this is what happens when you let anybody vote. So they were already saying that. But at the same time, we were moving away from like American government only being run by the wealthy, and that's a good thing in my opinion. Well, thanks y'all for listening, and have a good day.